Hi everybody, we might get the evening underway. I know there's still some of you coming in and getting drinks from the bar. Feel free to do that, but we will kick off the evening. Welcome to the second event for North Sydney Conversations. My name's Susie Bessel. So pleased to see all of you here tonight. Thanks for joining us. North Sydney Conversations is a group run by volunteers. There's four of us, myself, Treen, who's here in the room, and Johnny and Liz, who you met at the desk on the way in. North Sydney Conversations was set up to provide a way for us to bring knowledgeable speakers together, have a conversation about topics that are of concern to people in the area and engage with other people around those issues. Climate change, obviously, is the topic we're dealing with tonight. We'll also cover other issues like integrity, media, and women's right to safety and equality. Before we get the evening underway, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet tonight, the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. It's with great pleasure that I introduce our panel tonight. And the topic that we're discussing is Reshaping Australia, our climate progress since the fires. Our expert panel will help us take stock of how climate change is already affecting Australia and what governments, businesses and investors are doing about it. I welcome Greg Mullins, former Fire and Rescue New South Wales Commissioner, who started fighting bushfires in 1971. He's a climate counsellor with the Climate Council and the founder of Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. Martijn Wilder is co-founder of climate change and investment firm Pollination. He's also president of WWF in Australia and the former chair of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency ARENA. And Jane Caro is a Walkley award-winning writer, novelist and social commentator, and she'll facilitate tonight's conversation. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Susie. Great to see so many people here tonight on a, fortunately not quite as chilly as it has been, Wednesday evening. Thank you all for coming to talk about climate. I can't think of anything more important to talk about, actually. I'm also delighted to be here with Greg and Martijn. Greg and I go back a very long way. We both went to Forest High together. And
good school.
Very good school, and he remembers me as a very naughty girl smoking cigarettes at the back of the bus, which I deny, absolutely denied, never happened. He had an afro, just so you know. The years are cruel.
The smokers used to blow smoke into my afro and it'd just... Anyway.
That's why he remembers me. Martijn, I have not met before, but I am extremely impressed by his commitment to, obviously, all things climate and bringing a business perspective to it, because it is interesting how business seems to be filling a vacuum left by government, and I think we'll talk about that a bit tonight. What we're going to do is I'm going to have a conversation with Greg and Martijn for about half an hour or so, and then I'm going to throw it open to the floor for you guys to ask questions. So as we go, if you think of something you want to ask, please do hang on to that. You will get a chance to ask it. And don't hang back when I open the floor to questions. I often find people feel nervous and won't ask them, and then they get very frustrated when we run out of time. So ask it fast. You have been warned. I want to ask, first of all, a question to both Martijn and Greg, which seems very topical at the moment, which is, guys, how do you reckon ScoMo went at the G7?
You go first. Well, he certainly differentiated Australia. So if he was marketing, we do stand out, but I think for all the wrong reasons. So Boris was very kind and said he admires the ambition, but that's about all we've got. So, and it's a very serious subject because the rest of the world seems to have woken up. At the least, they're aiming for net zero by 2060, apart from 2050 and 2060 China. But massive cuts, US 78% by 2035, I think, the US, Joe Biden. What are we doing? We've got the most lax targets for Kyoto and for Paris, and we're sticking to them, and we're not going to use our Kyoto credits now because COVID's helped us get down, so we won't cheat. We'll just sort of amble along. So, no, sorry.
What mark would
Prime
you give
Minister,
him?
fail.
Fail. Okay, that's fair enough. Martijn, are you any kinder?
I think it's just a little bit of a parallel universe that goes on. So I think at one level, the world is moving very fast. Everyone's committing to net zero by 2050, which in any event is too late, but that's where we're moving. And I think it's almost like the government just pretends this is not an issue, and every other leader is saying, well, this is the issue. And what's interesting, you heard there was a report this morning on Boris Johnson was speaking about the meeting, and his Greek said he was quite diplomatic and polite, but then his trade negotiator said, well, there'll be no trade agreement unless you get to 2050, and make that announcement. So I think at the political level, there's this nice sort of dancing around the issue, but at the hard negotiation level, it's pretty clear. And all of the major corporates in Australia are petrified about trade sanctions. They're all of the view that the EU and the UK and the Americans are going to put in trade embargoes on our products because Australia's not doing enough.
And we've already got trade embargoes on our products from China for a completely different reason.
True.
Excellent. So we're pissing everybody off.
That's right. And
Awesome work.
It's not a difficult, we'll come to this, I'm sure, but every state government's committed to net zero by 2050. The Business Council has. Most corporates have. So I'm a little bit perplexed as to why the government doesn't do. They've sort of de facto done it. They've sort of said, we're going to move towards net zero by 2050. They haven't actually said we're going to do it.
No. And there was a Four Corners program that seemed to suggest it was major donors that was what part of the issue, mostly fossil fuel companies.
Yeah, I would actually argue all the fossil fuel companies are well ahead of the government.
Okay.
And I don't think that's the problem. I think there's four key people within the Liberal Party or the National Party that are the issue.
Okay.
Yeah, but we can come back to that.
There's a gang of four. Excellent. We will definitely come back to the gang of four. Next, I'd like to ask you, Greg, given that this is a meeting about our climate progress since the fires, you've been fighting fires since 1971 in our old stamping ground of Terry Hills. You must have been, 14? 15?
I was 12.
12.
But anyway.
12. They let 12-year-olds fight fires in 1971. Hope they don't now.
I was good.
I'm sure. Nevertheless. What has been your lived experience starting in 1971 as a 12-year-old and right up to the last fire you fought in person, which was?
Gospers Mountain, 2020.
Right, so
early 2020.
The Armageddon fires, really. How have you seen it change? What's that like?
It's a really big question, so I'll try and encapsulate it. So my father fought fires before me, so that's why I started early, because he kept taking off, jumping on a fire truck, and I thought that was pretty cool. And then we had a big fire locally, and they just needed everybody. But look, it was predictable. I used to talk to Dad about the fire seasons, and he'd say that wattles come out early, the Christmas beetles are here, the bogong moths, whatever. He saw all these indicators, and all the old bushies knew what was going on. My mum used to study the bush and how it was. So we knew when a bad fire season was coming, and they're about 10 or 11 years apart, particularly in the Blue Mountains in Sydney, different in different places. They suddenly, from 1994, the 1994 fires in January came out of the blue, literally. It was raining in November, and that was a big indicator to me each year. If you get storms in November, normally Sydney Blue Mountains wouldn't get bad fires. It just stopped raining after that, and we got these massive fires. We got blocking highs over New Zealand, and westerly winds. So I won't go into all the meteorology, but it was very odd. And from there, the frequency of major fires in this area went from 11 years to about 6 years. So we had major fires again in 1997, 2001, 2002, Canberra in 2003, the world's first recorded, there were others, but really first recorded fire tornado. 2006 in the Blue Mountains, 2009, Black Saturday. So it just went on. And 2013 in the Blue Mountains was a real wake-up call because there was no El Nino, and it was like El Nino for bushfires was like extra logs on the fire. If you had an El Nino, you knew this will be a bad summer. And if you had a drought and an El Nino, that's the big one. We didn't have a drought, we didn't have an El Nino, and it came 7 weeks earlier than any fires in history in New South Wales where we'd had massive property loss. And it was our most damaging fire season in New South Wales. And it just got worse from there. So 2020, group of 33 ex-fire chiefs, 34, one of our members has since passed away, tried to tell the government that something bad was coming. Even we didn't realise just how bad. And the weather conditions, number of days over 39 degrees through that summer equalled what we'd got in the previous 109 years. So just in 1 year. So that the weather is out of control. There's no other explanation for it. We heard a lot of denial, that gang of four that Martijn talks about, the rubbish that they put on social media, it's arsonists, it's the greenies, stopping burning, we should do more back burning, so they don't know what they're talking about. It's called hazard reduction, gang of four. But there was just all this denial, trying to deflect, and that was our job, to try and get across to people, no, this is really bad and we can't fight these fires anymore. We don't know what to do with them.
Yes, that seems to have been the impression. Martijn, I'm going to guess the gang of four includes Matt Canavan.
Yep, Craig Kelly.
Craig Kelly. Craig Kelly? Someone will have him in their gang?
I mean,
How sad.
yeah, I mean, the problem is not, from my observation, and it's quite an interesting observation, is that we have actually quite a good story to tell on climate as a country. So we've got state governments that are fairly active, and you know, they've committed to net zero. We've got Victoria's got one of the leading climate change acts in the world, which requires them every 5 years to put in place a plan to reduce emissions across every sector of the economy. We've got other governments that... South Australia is often 100% renewable energy and is often selling energy. It's zero. It's you know, you don't have to pay for it, it's free. It's got so much solar. We've got the highest uptake of rooftop solar in the world. We've got two of the most outstanding institutions in the world, which is CFC and ARENA, although as of today, ARENA can fund gas. That's another issue. But they're two very good organisations. And historically, we've done a tremendous amount on land-based offsets through our offsetting program under the ERF. So we actually have quite a good story to tell. The major missing piece at a governmental level is, number one, there are certain people in the government that still don't believe in climate change. But number two, that we're not doing anything to mitigate the reduction of emissions. So we have a safeguard mechanism, which is a law which caps bigger polluters, but it's set so low that only a few are caught. We had an emissions trading scheme and the emissions went down significantly, but we now have no measure. And we have a federal government that politically will not commit to net zero by 2050. So if the government went around the world and said, we're committing to net zero by 2050, and by the way, we're doing all of these things and we're investing in this, the political reception would be completely different. I mean, it's just sort of, it doesn't even make sense as to why you would just hold out, because every state government's done it, the business council's done it. You should just commit to it and get on with it.
So you say it doesn't make sense?
It doesn't make any sense. Well, it doesn't make any sense.
So what's your theory behind why?
Because I think there is still a number of... It's this simple. If the government wants to win the election, it needs a particular number of seats. It's factoring that those seats are in northern Queensland, and there's key seats there, and if they can win those seats, they believe they'll hold into government. And there's a trade-off between those seats and the ones in Victoria that are the more liberal, the more small liberal seats that could swing to independence, like Warringah did.
Or even North Sydney.
Yep. And so therefore, it's a numbers game, basically. That's really what it comes down to. And you saw that, and interestingly, you saw in Queensland after the last federal election, I don't know if anyone observed this, but after the last federal election in Queensland, the day after the federal election, Al Gore was in Brisbane doing a major summit on climate change. There was a business lunch with over 1,000 people, and when the federal government won the election, the state government freaked because they thought it was all about coal, and they suddenly pulled out all these events that day, and it was quite remarkable. The Queensland government has just now gone in that direction and announced a massive renewable energy investment in Queensland, and so they're going the opposite direction to the feds. But it all comes down to those political seats, basically. It's a numbers game.
Right.
And I don't believe that that's really the issue.
You don't?
No.
You think they've miscalculated?
Well, I don't think that people are voting that over climate. I think there are other issues that the Labor Party lost the last election, or the government won the election, including franking credits. But I don't think climate is the election issue. That
is the
people
vote
need.
changer,
Yeah.
or stopping people voting for the Labor Party?
Yeah.
Well, it would be hard to think that it would, because, okay, they're slightly better in their policies than the Liberal Party, but they're not exactly leading.
Yeah, so I'm not commenting on I can do that later,
Yeah.
on the policies of either side of government. I'm just saying that the reason the government is still balking and holding off, I believe, is because of the numbers issue about being re-elected.
So
Because the fact is, if the Queensland government have now gone net zero by 2050, the New South Wales government have done it. Queensland government's there's a huge Queensland government just put out over a $2 billion plan last week about making Queensland a renewable energy hub for the future. So the momentum is there to do this, and quite frankly, the business community is there, so it doesn't make much sense.
No.
Yeah.
And if we don't, if we continue, you had a line that somebody said today about how this government, and Scott Morrison in particular, kind of delay. What were the 4 words?
It was in the front of the Canberra Times today. It was the government. I'm not going to remember it, but they basically sort of deny, defer, delayed. And just it's sort of you say this is going on. I said no, it's not.
Yeah.
Well, actually, yes, it is. So a really interesting example of this is the gas plant that's been announced up in the Hunter, right? So if you take the view in Australia, we have a very difficult energy system. It's very volatile. We're going through a period of change where traditionally energy was big power stations and they transported power into the cities via transmission lines. We've now suddenly gone to a system where we've pumped in a huge amount of solar. The system is getting a little bit more unstable. It is more unstable. Therefore, as we take off big plants that can run all the time with plants that can't, we need to put more storage in the system. That's happening with batteries, and so we're building a system. The system is in a state of flux, and it's rapidly in a state of flux, and it's moving very quickly. And we're one of the leaders in energy technology in the world, and that's really interesting as to how that's playing out. And one of the things that will do is, or one of the things that is doing is it's allowing us to adopt technology way ahead of anybody else. So that gas plant, so the theory of the government is we need a gas plant to have reliability, that if the solar and wind don't work for a day, we can turn the gas on. Well, at the moment, we've basically got far more energy than we need, and we're going to build more energy. So and the New South Wales government's building renewable energy hubs, and it's sitting there thinking, and no investor will touch that plant. It is not economic.
Yeah,
so it's our taxpayer money which will fund that plant, which will be turned on 2% of the year, if at all.
Taxpayer takes the risk. What's the line they use? Privatise the profits, socialise the losses.
Yeah.
Greg, what will happen? You've described what has happened since 1994, and the way fires and things have exponentially increased in not just frequency but also in intensity. What will happen if we don't? If not just us, but the world as a whole does not manage to cut emissions and control global warming to 1.5 degrees?
Look, it's actually pretty clear, and you talk about parallel universe. Ross Garnaut back in 2012, was it?
Yeah.
Or 2008, I can't remember. But he said by 2021 there'll be bigger bushfires, and the changes will be directly observable. Well, he was pretty well right, wasn't he? So detailed scientific studies, attribution studies of these fires have all concluded, yes, these fires could not have happened without the influence of climate change. We've never had weather like it before. And one of the studies that's really chilling and frightens me says that the conditions we had in 2019, the hottest, driest year ever experienced in Australia, will be average by 2040. That's even if they start taking action on emissions, no matter what, it's locked in, and will be exceptionally cool by 2060. So bushfires, if it's average by 2040, we're just going to get more and more. The frequency of major bushfire seasons is going to get closer and closer together. The forests aren't going to look like they did when I was a kid, when everybody here were kids or are kids. The animals that I saw, my grandkids aren't going to see them because huge parts of New South Wales have been denuded, 3 billion animals killed or displaced. And it's irreversible. And the Royal Commission said, no matter what we do now, it's going to get worse. But by mid-century, if we reduce emissions now, we might be able to stabilise it by mid-century and then eventually try to bring it down. But somehow we'll have to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We'll have to draw down somehow to actually change it. So it's an incredibly scary scenario. And my lifetime of work, and I'm a volunteer firefighter still, was to protect people, and knowing that you can't actually do that. And I fought fires up near Grafton, Bateman's Bay on New Year's Eve, all over the state, Blue Mountains, many fires. I can't remember all the fires I went to during that season, but the helplessness, not just watching hundreds of homes burn and think, well, the future's here. You know, we warned about it. Even we couldn't really grasp just how bad it could get. And I went to California in October 2019, and they're worse. They're a little bit ahead of us.
So I don't know if you remember, so I used to chair the New South Wales Climate Change Council, or it's still, I'm not quite sure if it still exists, but it sort of does. And Greg was there as a Fire Commissioner representative. I remember asking you during the fires, we said to you, well, tell us, you know, these fires are happening, and, you know, as it gets hotter, what happens? And you said, well, we've spent years studying bushfires in 39, 40 degree heat, but when there's a 41, 42 degree day, you've got no idea how they react. And we asked you, well, what do you do? You said you just get out of there because things just spontaneously combust. So we've had 50 degree days. So, I mean, you know, we don't know. And the other problem is that, you know, when you look at the Paris Agreement, talks about net zero, and everyone's talking about net zero by 2050. We should be thinking about net zero by 2035. 2050 is gone.
That's what
it's run away.
Saying.
So we've now got to be bringing that back. And so we're sort of in this catch-up all the time, and then you get into these circular loops of things, and we just don't know what's going to happen. That's part of the challenge. And so we've locked in a certain amount of emissions already, and the question will be, will we be able to stabilise, or will things just start to collapse and ecosystems collapse? We don't know the answer.
And look, if I could just throw in one big indicator, through my dad told me about the 1939 bushfires, January 1939, and he said there was lightning coming out of the smoke and starting new fires 20 miles away. And I went, yeah, right. And then years later, I heard about pyrocumulonimbus clouds, so fire-caused storms. So from 1978 to 2018, there were 60 in Australia, all across Australia, over that, 40 years? 40 years. That season, there were 29 in 1 year, and it's all about heat. So these fires burning under 45, 49 degrees with extreme dryness, they're just so much hotter. The smoke plume reaches into the stratosphere and brings the gale force winds down to the ground. And we just run away. One firefighter, his fire truck got picked up, dropped on its roof. He died, he was crushed, and the rest of the crew got severe burns because the fire just overran them. So this is what we're dealing with. This is what California's dealing with, and fire tornadoes.
And the interesting thing about that is I think it was in the last couple of days, and it goes back to the intersection between business and what's going on, is that more and more people are finding they cannot get house insurance. You know, you cannot, if you are in a fire-prone area, if you live in the Blue Mountains, if you live on a ridgeline, etc., you cannot get house insurance. Surely things like this, ordinary householders unable to insure their most people's most valuable asset is their home. Surely this puts pressure on government to get more active.
So the two organisations that have some of the most valuable information on climate change is Munich Re and Swiss Re, right? These are insurers and reinsurers that have studied this, and Munich Re will tell you all of the climate statistics of Australia, what's going on, where things are, because they've basically been modelling it for 30 years. So yes, you're right. In a lot of areas in Queensland, you cannot get house insurance. Cannot get house insurance, you cannot get a mortgage. So it's sort of the wrong. But no, I don't think. I think basically what happens is the government turns around and says to the insurance companies, "You have to do it," and they say, "We're not going to do it." So we're in a really interesting dynamic, because if you take AGL as a good example, AGL had said, "We've got an old coal plant. It's come to the end of its life. It's going to cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars."
You're talking about Liddell.
Yeah, it's going to cost us hundreds of thousands, and Hazelwood, hundreds of thousands, if not, $500 million to fix that so it can run for another 10 years. We will not make the money back on that. Our shareholders, therefore, it's not in the interests of our shareholders to invest in that plant because our shareholders will make a loss. And it's not our role as a power company with shareholders to meet the government's objectives. The government should have an energy policy. So then the government turns around and says, no, you've got to keep that open. And the CEO says, well, we're not going to keep it open because it's a huge loss for our shareholders. And we have, under the corporations law, a responsibility to our shareholders. So it is an interesting dynamic that's going on. And, the government trying to dictate what corporates should do. And these corporates want to shut this down because they say, we need to decarbonise, we've got a commitment, we need to turn off coal, and instead we're investing in renewables. And they're being told by the government of the day, keep the coal running. And so Boris Johnson said this morning, he did say on the radio, I was listening this morning, he said, I said to Scott Morrison that X number of years ago we had this amount of coal and now I've got 2%. And it's going to be out of the system quite soon. So, most of the countries are on that trajectory. So it is interesting. But I think also the connectivity between what's going on, businesses being more aligned to. So one of the biggest advocates of trying to convince the Brazilian government not to shut down, not to destroy the Amazon is actually Bayer, which is sort of ironic. But because Bayer have worked out that if the Amazon goes, US agriculture is dead. Because there's no rainfall that comes from the Amazon across. And you look at the weather patterns. If that happens, then they've got no product to sell in agriculture in the US. But it's just interesting, these connections are now being made in a way they weren't before.
That is interesting and terrifying at the same time. So then we get a situation, and both comment on this, where I saw recently letters being written by government ministers decrying banks, for example, as activists. As being activists by refusing to take on risks. I find this fascinating because this is a conservative government. This is a Liberal government, pro-business, pro-competition, pro-free markets. I've always been told. I always believed them when they said it. This doesn't make any sense.
So this is, to be fair, Freiberg, to his credit, did actually come out and say, I don't agree with that. But there were, they basically said, because we do a lot of advice on this issue, and I'm talking to a bank, and the bank says, okay, should I lend money? And all the banks have now decided coal's out of the system, right? No one's going to lend money to coal anymore. So they say next, okay, am I going to lend money to gas? Should I do that? So the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, one of the most conservative organisations in the world, said a month ago, we should have no more coal or oil or gas in the world. We should have no more. We should not invest in any new facilities. That is an enormous call. So I'm sitting there firstly as a bank thinking, okay, well, the most conservative energy authority in the world is saying no more oil, gas or coal, so we shouldn't be thinking about that. Secondly, if I lend money to a gas plant, so if I want to fund someone who produces energy, I have a choice. I can lend money to a gas plant. Now, if a gas plant's going to be built from scratch, that is a huge capital cost to invest in that, and that's going to require me 10 years to get my return back from selling gas. I know at the same time that I can get a renewable facility up and running. It can be built with the same amount of power, with batteries, in 6 months, at a significantly lower cost, and it can be dismantled without any contamination issues at the end of it. So the cost scenario is, well, that is going to lose me money, and if I lend the money, it's not going to get it back. If I lend it to the renewables, I will get it back. So the banks are sitting here thinking, okay, we have a corporations law objective, again, obligation to manage money responsibly. We can't just throw money. We've got to be very careful as directors. As directors, we've got to make decisions on climate change risk that don't breach our directors' duties. And by the way, the New Zealand government's passed a law that says if you as a director don't consider climate change in your decisions on investing and you get it wrong, there's a 5-year jail term. So that is coming as well in other countries. And so therefore, what you're looking at is a banker making a decision, well, okay, this gas is really unfinanceable, this renewables is financeable. If I do fund the gas, how long do I know before I can get my money back? Actually, they're not going to be able to repay it for 7 years. Therefore, if they want to borrow the money, the cost of capital has just gone up. So rather than paying me a 5% interest rate, you've got to pay me a 25% interest rate because I need to get the money back sooner. A higher cost of capital means it's even more unfinanceable than it was in the first place. And now the banks are saying, for how long do I actually even lend to gas at all? Which means you go from a high cost of capital to no availability of capital. So a lot of these old facilities would just not be able to borrow money to build it, which means if they want to build it, you come back to the government, you come back to Hunter Valley where the government's funding this project, there's no bank in the world will do it. And that's what's happened with Adani as well. So that's the really interesting dynamic. So the government should not be telling power companies to keep coal power stations open and shouldn't be telling banks that you should lend money irresponsibly.
And are the government also trying to tell the current fire commissioners how to do their job as well?
I've got to watch what I say. Look, when I was commissioner, it was made very clear to me in the 2009 Black Saturday fires, because I did an interview for the Herald and said, look, this is clearly the effects of climate change, and it was, and here's how it's tracking. And I was a member of New South Wales Government's Climate Council, and I was dragged in by my minister and told in no uncertain terms, get in front of the cameras, have your lovely black helmet, tell them all about the fire, but that's policy stuff.
Don't mention the CC word.
No. So the current fire commissioners are very reluctant. They've got a tough job. As things get worse, all of their traditional tools are being taken away. Hazard reduction, so the windows are getting smaller where they can burn. When they burn, they either get away or don't work because it's been raining. So they're under pressure to do that. Community education, all that sort of stuff. The firefighters are increasingly doing response work, so they get less time to get out in the community and help mitigate what's going on. And they don't want to get into a public fight with Barnaby Joyce and Matt Canavan and Kelly and Mr Morrison and
Is that the Gang of Four?
Oh no, it's a gang of... And I mean, my group, they tried to sideline us, say that we're being disrespectful to the current fire chiefs. No, all power to them. We were trying to say things we knew that they couldn't, because we couldn't when we were in the jobs.
Were you on the council when Frank Sartor was minister?
No.
So
yes, I was, yeah.
So there was this interesting case where a couple of premises had fallen into the sea up at Byron. And he had just come back, and I mean, he was really candid, right? He was pretty gung-ho on climate and pretty candid. And he basically said, these houses should never be built on the cliff. We all know there's climate change. We all know there's storm surge. We all know they're going to fall into the sea. There's no local council policy on climate change. No one wants to admit it. And so therefore, what happens is, and no one will insure it, insurance companies don't insure it, so I go up there, and what do? I write a cheque. Because basically, if I don't write a cheque, the political shit hits the fan, and it's just better for me to write the cheque and just be done. I mean, and that's the truth of it, right? I mean, that is, there is no long-term plan in this issue. There's no energy plan in this country for what we're going to do long-term. It just doesn't exist. And so the result is that business is picking it up, and things are moving. The state governments are trying to coordinate this. But it's,
Sounds a bit like COVID.
That's right, that's right.
It was a bit different to COVID because they listened to experts and the science and
I know, it's
acted
funny
on it.
that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite different actually.
I thought that was really weird that they suddenly had this, come to
Epiphany.
Jesus moment and thought the scientists knew what they were talking about.
So, and look, it really is a parallel universe, because even when the Farmers Federation came out and said, we think we need to be net 50, the Agriculture Minister got stuck into them and said, well, you can't do that, because if you want to do that, you need to have a plan. And my understanding of national plans is the national government does that.
So the Farmers Federation, the Meat and Livestock Association...
they're activists.
The major farmer groups have all committed to net zero by 2050. So Barnaby hasn't.
No, and look, you just... But you watch the business sector, and you talked about privatising profits and socialising
losses.
Losses. So insurance, the insurers, they're getting big hits, catastrophic hits over and over and over. Storms in Victoria last week, storms here, floods, fires. Reinsurers are saying no. So they're saying, well, and what happens is we pay. We pay. So we have to rebuild people's homes for them. And they'll build back where they shouldn't be because no, there's no such thing. So, but business is moving, and our trading partners are saying we're not going to buy your coal. So what happens to all those people who need new jobs, new industries?
Yes, a transition plan, that would be good too. Well, the interesting thing is there has been a slight move. I do remember in the late lamented 2019 election when Bill Shorten was castigated for wanting to steal our weekend. Do you remember? Because he was going to take everyone's utes away from them. But now we have, I don't know what Bill was going to do with them. I was never clear about that, but nevertheless.
Lined up for questions.
I know, but I'll just finish with this last one. We have had a bit of a change rhetoric over electric vehicles, though, haven't we? Even by a federal government. Do you think they finally woke up to the realisation that if they...
I must have missed that.
Oh yeah, they started to say they were going to sort of encourage
Hybrids.
them, and they were right behind them.
They say they're going to encourage them right behind a lot of things, but it never happens.
Oh, okay. So it's another photo op, no follow up. Okay, I was
And
optimistic.
so come back to what is our policy to encourage electric vehicles? It's a state government taxing them. I mean, it's insane, right? Every other country in the world is encouraging electric vehicles and the uptake. I mean, during the start of COVID, I was talking to the New Zealand Climate Minister, and he said, for us, EVs are critical for two reasons. One, because we want to reduce our emissions in New Zealand, and all of our energy is basically renewables, and you put that into cars and you have no emissions. And secondly, our balance of payments is basically most of our foreign currency goes offshore. Most of our New Zealand currency goes offshore in oil payments. If we get rid of that, suddenly New Zealand doesn't have a massive outflow of New Zealand dollars out of the country, so it benefits our balance of payments. That's just smart thinking, right? It's really smart thinking. Why aren't we thinking like that in Australia?
Well, I'm not all that clever, but I worked out that if we didn't get EV vehicles and they came in, that we would become the dumping ground for every piece of shit petrol and diesel car made in the rest of the world. That we would just be Australia the mugs.
And if you go to Fiji now, they have all the old hybrids where the batteries are dying, and so they're going to have the old hybrids and they're going to be stuck with the batteries. They've got no way to fix it.
Yeah, we won't even be that good. Okay, I think we're getting to the time where we need to ask questions from the floor. But just before I do, I'll ask this question at the very end. So, who has a question? Please. Oh yes, right up the back, of course. Someone's going to run. Portrine is going to run with the microphone for you. I'll meet her a quarter of the way.
Hi, thanks guys. Byron here. Just a question about the role of traditional Indigenous fire management in the future for managing this more intense and frequent fire environment we're going to be living in. Thank you.
Thanks, Byron. Yeah, great question. Look, there's no such thing as this is Indigenous burning. It's different in Kakadu, it's different in Bundjalung, Northern Rivers, it's different here, Victoria. It depends on type of country. Now, one of the big issues, so does it have a role? Definitely. Is it being funded? No. So governments seem to expect Indigenous communities to just do this for free and go out there, and then they'll say, well, they haven't got jobs here because they're out doing the burning you asked them to do. So it needs to be funded. That's number one. Number two, it can't be done at scale at the moment because there simply aren't enough people who know how to do it. Now, there's organisations like Fire Sticks Alliance who are out there training communities how to do it and getting the knowledge back. Around here, 1789, smallpox wiped out 50 to 80% of the traditional owners. A lot of the others were shot, taken away. We've got a pretty bad history there, if you bother looking at it. So the traditional knowledge actually doesn't exist in huge parts of Australia, so it has to be resurfaced. So look, it's a different philosophy and way of burning. So it's not just getting a drip torch and burning in a different way, putting drops here rather than a big line of fire. It's understanding the wallabies have their joeys now, don't burn at the moment. That tree's flowering, it's producing seeds, wait till it's done that. These birds are nesting, let them rear their young before you burn. So a deep connection to country that I haven't got, nobody here has, and so it's being reborn, and it's a wonderful thing, but it must be resourced properly. And it needs to be owned by traditional owners, and there'll be a whole lot of sociological positives in that as well as environmental positives. But it's not the silver bullet. There's no silver bullet because it's getting so bad.
Who else has a question over there? Yes?
This is a question for Martijn. The Nationals have a rusted-on base that is resilient and allows the leadership to become the puppets of the fossil fuel industry. But will that base be so loyal when it's attacked by tariffs or other measures by affecting our export trade. And if that does happen, and presumably it will fairly soon with carbon leakage, talking to the Herald today about carbon leakage proposals from the EU, how long do we have before we start to see the politicians being forced to address the concerns of its base?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think in this term of government the politicians on the Nat side or on the Libs who are sort of sceptical on climate will change their position. I don't think that will happen. It'll take a change of government for that to happen. I think, however, what is interesting in the dynamic is that if let's take the two sectors you mentioned, oil and gas and the farmers. So in oil and gas, most of the oil and gas companies have not only committed to net zero by 2050, they've also committed to eliminate Scope 3 emissions, which is pretty significant. They're doing a huge amount of, they're still burning oil and gas, but they're rapidly reducing new oil and gas. And there's a phase out of a lot of existing projects as well. There's also a huge amount of effort being put into investing in offsetting projects. One of those offsetting projects to reduce emissions is soil carbon. And the interesting thing is that many farmers around Australia are now very focused on soil carbon. And interestingly, that is one thing that part of the federal government, which is where it gets very interesting, like Little Proud to a lesser extent, but definitely Angus Taylor are very focused on soil carbon. You've got other ministers in the government that are quite anti it. It's quite a bizarre thing. Yet, the major agricultural producers in this country, like AACO and others, and you've got the Meat and Livestock Association, you've got some of the big sovereign wealth funds in Queensland are all suddenly jumping onto how do we do farming in a more sustainable way? How do we reduce emissions from farming? Our supply chains are doing it. And the big sort of ticket investments you're seeing is to invest more carbon, to do more soil carbon projects, and the federal government has a method where you can get credit for that. And the other one is actually seaweed. So a huge amount of effort going to seaweed to feed cows Asparagopsis, which reduces emissions in methane emissions by 90%. So there's a real focus in the sector on that, and CSIRO have been leading Future Feed as well. So what's interesting is that, and the oil and gas sector, I know that one of the big oil and gas companies from Europe is investing in agriculture in Australia to do soil carbon. So it's a case where the business sector is actually a step ahead, despite what the politicians are doing. They're just fed up. They're just fed up of listening to the politics and just going ahead and trying to fix it. And the other really interesting dynamic that I think is going on, which often isn't picked up, part of the reason that you see corporates sort of a bit scatty sometimes is that, and this is a point Jay made before, so first of all you have a lot of the CEOs in Australia want to go out there and lead. The Business Council has changed its position and is going to lead partly because they've got a new leader on the Business Council, Tim Reid, who's much more progressive, and that's driving a lot of that change. But in a lot of those corporate departments, the CEOs come out and say something and the government whacks them on the head. So you saw that with Alan Joyce, you've seen that with when Andrew McKenzie was running BHP, you saw that as well. And a lot of these these big corporates have corporate affairs departments. The corporate affairs departments are full of ex-staffers from Liberal ministers' offices or national ministers' offices, and they tell the CEOs, don't go out and say that because you'll upset the government. So that's a really interesting dynamic that's also playing out. So I think that basically a lot of the businesses just have had enough of government policy. We're just going to get on with it. And they work with those ministers in the government that are progressive and that do want to do things, and they forget about the others. Because in some sense, you compare where Barnaby Joyce is, what he says on climate, compared to, Little Proud is a much more progressive, and you compare him to where Taylor is on ag, they might as well be on other sides of the political spectrum. It's quite extraordinary.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Kayi. This is my question to Greg. Following on from the question earlier, back to you. You were talking about traditional burning, but and how a lot of the practices have since been lost. But wouldn't you say that that's actually pretty dangerous, or we need to do a lot more research in that area, because what may have been done 200 odd years ago is no longer applicable or too dangerous to do today because of the changed conditions due to climate change. And the other thing I've come across in my reading is that with hazard reduction burns, are we not conditioning the plants to also cope with higher temperatures? And isn't that also exacerbating the issue as well? So what can be done there?
That's you must be a scientist.
I'm not a scientist. No, I'm just a very curious person.
So this is just, and the frustration during the fires, hearing Barnaby Joyce come out and saying, see the footpath? It's not on fire. You know why? There's no fuel there. But there's fuel out there, and it's a bloody national parks, and they've locked it up, and
Anything Barnaby Joyce says creates that reaction.
But look, there's so much in what you said. So journals of what Sydney looked like when the first fleet arrived, it was mainly grasslands, and you could walk, you can't walk through Ku-ring-gai Chase or Royal National Park because of the scrub. Frequent burning, high intensity burning, tends to bring back stuff that's adapted to that, and then it burns again and burns again and burns again. There's research to say if you leave a forest 25, 30 years, dry sclerophyll forest, it'll become less flammable. But with the weather conditions, that's almost impossible now. So we're having to do different types of burning, and the hope is that some traditional burning will start to heal country, and it won't look like people think the bush should look like now, because it looks so much different to what it was 200 years ago, and none of us are that old. So there's a great deal. Western Australia, they've lost 20% less rainfall in southwestern Margaret River, southwestern Western Australia. They have hectare targets every year. So what they do, they get aircraft and they just burn the hell out of 200,000 hectares every year. And with the dryness, it's killing the jarrah forests. And the swamps are burning because the peat, they used to have water in them, now it's peat. So they're burning, they'll never come back, there's habitats. But there's a big group of ex-forestry people saying, no, you just burn everything and then you won't get fires. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? So, and look, lastly, the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre is now being reborn into an institute, and they put out a draft thing, and I had to draw to their attention, as did a number of other people, there was nothing there about Indigenous burning. So they're re-looking at that because they got a wee bit of hurry up from numerous angles saying, are you joking? You're not even going to look at this? So I don't have the answers. And sorry if I sound a bit of a wet blanket, but this is really serious.
It's a bit more like a dry, crispy
blanket. And look, my frustration trying to talk to this government is they just don't want to know. And I think they've got to be booted out, whether it's by independents or... So
just on the savanna burning, so for full disclosure, Byron and I work on a project that is taking Indigenous savanna burning, spearheaded by the Kimberley Land Council and Darwin University, into other countries around the world, as well as doing it in Australia. Now, traditional Indigenous savanna burning, which is what Greg was talking about, is fundamentally critical because one of the biggest sources of emissions in the world is uncontrolled fire. And people don't realise, just when you have these massive bushfires, how much CO2 is. So anything you can do to reduce that over a period of time is absolutely critical. And the other thing about it is that, so in Australia, it creates Indigenous employment, it brings back people in the country, it re-engages communities, so it's very important from not just a climate perspective, but where Byron and I have been working in Botswana, they have areas where you just get these uncontrolled burns because it's not done properly, because either for natural reasons or other reasons. And it just wipes out whole communities and whole tourism areas. The Okavango just gets destroyed. So it's a real way to sort of try to manage what is and now a new natural phenomenon of uncontrolled fires that weren't there in the way they were before, but because we've caused because of climate. So from my perspective, not only is it a really phenomenal opportunity for Australia, but it's a phenomenal opportunity for us to export that to all those equatorial regions around the world that are in the same zone. And that's sort of one of the projects that Byron and I have been working on.
Who else has a question? There's one here, one there, and the lady down there has the microphone there for you. You'll go.
It's Diana here. My question is for Martijn. The lady over there mentioned, we can't burn the same way as we did before. But my big concern also is wildlife, and with your role with WWF,
yep.
What's your prediction with our endangered species, and have we got any hope of stopping many of our animals going to extinction?
There will be a huge amount of extinction of different species. That's going to happen regardless. And we're losing species all the time. The question is, can some of them be brought back? Some no, and others, but there will be quite significant extinction. And the other issue is that some of those animals that live in particular zones, as the climate changes, it's just not survivable anymore. So they will go extinct. It's a real problem. It's a real issue. And again, what's interesting is, and this comes back to also, I mean, I hate to say this, but partly an economic argument, which is that we don't value nature, right? So in the last 6 months, I can show you 30 reports from investment banks and from institutions that say biodiversity is critical, we have to save it, we have to protect it, and on not one of those reports is there a way that they're going to do it. It just says we've got to do it, but doesn't actually say how. So, there needs to be some other mechanism by which we do that. So an interesting, just one example, which I was talking to someone about yesterday, we've just said that every major corporate in the world has to pay 15% tax. That came out of the G7. So why don't we say every major corporate in the world has to fund 15% of the world's biodiversity? Just put a tax on them, just require them to do it. I mean, to have an agreement on it and start saving that biodiversity. There are things that we can do, but at the moment, because the greater economic use is to use land in a way that chops down forests or clears land for agriculture and hurts biodiversity, that always trumps protecting nature.
Yes.
Do I have to stand up? No.
No.
Hi, Susie Gold here. Early in June, I went to a QBE annual general meeting, and I spoke on behalf of Market Forces. And what I said was, I saw that on Monday the federal government announced it's creating a $10 billion tax fund-funded reinsurance pool to deal with skyrocketing insurance premiums in northern Australia caused by worsening and more unpredictable extreme weather. So do you guys believe that distorting the insurance market in this way is good for public funds? But the point that we were all horrified was that the managing director managed to have this entire meeting without using the word climate change once. Sorry, I just find it amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing.
4th of June.
Yeah, it is amazing. And for their business, so in New Zealand, if that director, you're making decisions and take that into account, and and you breach the act, you go to jail up to 5 years. So that legislation will roll its way out in other jurisdictions. I mean, the penalty may not, but in France and the UK there are clear laws now on disclosure, what you have to do as directors, and here there's clear directors' duties on climate. And even, may I say, that one of the, even as late as early last year, one of the Australia's senior chairman, who was chair of a bank called Citibank, so you can work out who it was, wrote a full-page article in the Fin Review saying that there was no such thing as climate and directors shouldn't worry about it. When you've got Noel Hartley and others writing opinions, it's just ridiculous, right? So yes, so for those guys, if you're an investor in that company and you're saying, well, you've got a huge exposure in the Northern Territory, should you really be insuring this? Because if you have a catastrophic event, that could send that insurance company broke.
Well, they're pretty well broke.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I could just throw in there, look, one of the things, I had a coffee with a well-known conservative radio broadcaster who I won't name because he was really good, and he said, I'll interview you if you promise not to say those two terrible words, climate change. He said, you can say emissions, you can say warming, you can say a lot. I said, why? And he said, 30 to 40% of my listeners will switch off as soon as they hear it because it's been demonised and it's they're dirty words on the certain side of politics, far right. You just don't say those words. And he gave me a full interview. It was face to face. Went into the studio and he said, "Good on you. You didn't say it. Well done." But he said, "I just get hate mail if I say it."
Just a word of comfort. I've been a feminist for 50 years. I've been told, don't use the F word, don't say you're a feminist. 89% of women are now feminists and 69% of Australians. So keep using climate change.
All right.
People change. The world changes.
So can I just make one comment, because we're sounding a bit depressing up here. So Australia, you need to understand that the rate of change on climate and on technology is phenomenal. Right? You don't see it sitting here in Australia. The way in which things are changing and how rapid that is, and how it's exciting, right? Stuff that's happening overseas. We're going to have green. I often hear politicians say, you can never have X. And I said, but they did that a year ago in Germany. You can never have Y, but I did that a year ago in France. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we don't think can happen is already happening. So that's the first point. The second point is, in many other countries in the world, they've all committed to net zero. The question is not what we're committing to, it's how we're going to get there. And there's something so the change from Trump to Biden is phenomenal, and you should not underestimate that. So one of my colleagues who was a partner in our firm was taken in to be the chief climate advisor for Janet Yellen, who's head of Treasury, to roll out an entire program on climate finance and how to get climate change integrated into the finance system and be a world leader on this. So I think, at one level, yes, there's a lot of challenges and it is pretty depressing, the politics here. But just remember, a lot of our state ministers and premiers are leading on this stuff. They're doing some really interesting things in Australia, and some of the technology plays. And we have an energy system that is completely, in many ways, I don't want to use the word, I mean, it's really challenging because we've got a lot of coal in it, but it's rapidly changing. It's an experiment. We're way ahead of the rest of the world. We have the highest concentration of rooftop solar, as I said before. We've got a state like South Australia, which is often 100% renewables. I mean, a lot of this stuff's pretty exciting what's going on here. And so we've just got to think that, I don't want to say, I mean, in terms of climate, we're pretty screwed in where it's going. But, there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening. And we've got to be, there is a lot of things that we can do, and it's going to be very exciting. And you will get to a point sooner than you expect where everyone will have EVs. You do charge them. You have solar. The whole system is integrated. And that is coming, right? It is coming. But, it's just fascinating how, you often in Australia forget just how incredible things are in other countries.
I think, yeah. Oh, there we go.
I have to say, I really don't want to ask this question after Martijn being so positive. Full disclosure, I'm Jane's partner and we own a rural property where at the top end of our valley there's about 15 families who all strive to hazard reduct every year, or backburn as the Liberal Party would call it. The problem surrounding that are the legal issues if a fire gets away from your fence boundary. Do you know if governments are even looking at this as an opportunity? Because there are plenty of families who are happy to hazard reduct so long as it doesn't actually come back to bite them.
Yeah, look, there's a really good program. Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales have partnered with New South Wales Rural Fire Service, and there's a program called Hotspots, and they go out and train landholders how to burn safely, and all the legal issues, all the rest, they're all dealt with. And wherever, so Clarence Valley and other valley up north, every year people burn off, the fires escape, and then they become big. And wherever Hotspots has been implemented, there's no more escapes. So there's some really good joint NGO government programs out there, and it's very cheap. Oh, well, it's cheap. You don't pay anything for it. But yes, so that now legislation-wise, no, I don't know of any moves to change the legislation because it is quite a necessary stick, I suppose, that they've got. If people burn indiscriminately and it gets away, you will be liable. But so reach out to NCC and RFS.
Yes, next person with the microphone.
Yeah, hi. Firstly, thank you very much. This is a great little get-together. And I suppose there's been a fair few fairly interesting and fairly pertinent points made. A young woman over here was basically stating that, fires that the Aboriginals were using are possibly not relevant for today. And I suspect what we do is that we manage land. And when we're living in the environment, we manage it to the best advantage that we can. And the Aborigines, I think we can have an enormous amount of pride and learn a lot from them because they lived in the environment, but they're also spiritually connected with it. And as a consequence, they survived for thousands and thousands of years. We've now got a situation where we've created a dominance of sclerophyll in the environment. And that dominance of sclerophyll not only creates much more fire volatile environments, but it also creates much more susceptibility to flood, drought, fire, and it's highly detrimental to the biological ecosystem. So,
Do you have a question, sir?
yeah, my question is, what do you mean by increasing biodiversity? And if you're looking for an answer to that, the reason why we increase biodiversity is to advance succession, so we get away from those fire volatile species, to advance community dynamics, so we get more complex environments, and the outcome of that is to create functioning ecosystem. Now, please.
Yes, you need to ask a question, I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll get to that.
No, could you get to it now, please?
So, do you believe that our ecological illiteracy is the major problem?
Okay. Look, so you answered most of your question, but look, you've obviously got a lot of knowledge of this, and I really respect that. And you've said things that I have no idea about, with floods and drought. Oh yes, okay, droughts. Yes. We introduced a European paradigm of fire. All fire is bad, put it out, and that's where it all started. So we're now paying the price for stopping traditional methods of managing the land and nourishing the land. And so here we are, 200 years. The people before us were 60,000. So...
But I think we are modifying, I mean, to come back to your point, we are modifying landscapes without understanding why we're doing it or what the ramifications are. The interesting thing about, when you look at the soil carbon debate, is that what they're doing is they're saying, well, wait a second, we shouldn't be putting fertiliser on this land. We should be allowing the natural crops to grow, the natural weeds to grow. We should be managing this land in a particular way that increases the soil carbon of the land, which, mind you, a lot of farmers are not supportive of, and I've got people I work with who you look at their land and the grass is this high in the middle of a drought, and next door it's not managed at all and it's dust, right? And you can see the difference, and they still don't believe it, still criticise them. But by managing the land in a particular way, people are starting to learn, well, actually, you go back to a space where your soil's more healthier, the environment's healthier, the biodiversity is healthier. In a bushfire, it recovers quicker. In a drought, the grass is longer, and overall, the productivity of the land's better. And I think that's a learning, right? You're going back to learn. We modify this in such a way. Then on the biodiversity issue, it's about having a rich biodiversity. I mean, when you look at some of what's happening in California, where bee populations have collapsed, right, because of pesticides. So you basically cannot pollinate, a lot of the fruit crops. So therefore, they're busting bees in. I mean, it sort of sounds insane, but that's sort of what's been happening. So biodiversity is critical for the planet, and most of the scientists that I work with say, yeah, we will get these collapses in part of the chain, and the rest of the chain collapses, and that's part of your problem. So to answer your question, what is? I can't remember something that was what is healthy biodiversity. It's basically having those biodiversity chains exist and being healthy and not collapsing. Anyway.
Yes.
Regarding electric vehicles, just a switch from, I lived in America for 25 years, and it's shocking to me to come back a year ago and see that everyone's getting around in a huge SUV in Australia. It wasn't like that when I left, and it hasn't been like that in California for probably 20 years. So how quickly could we get things changed here? I mean, obviously it depends on the government, or does it? How can we get everyone out of their SUVs? I just don't get it. It's strange to me.
Well,
into an electric SUV, whatever.
If you're in California, I mean, when I was in California, I think there was no registration or reduced registration. The sales tax was reduced. It was cheaper to get an EV, but here I'd love to get an EV, but I just can't afford it. So,
Yeah, we have tax benefits to have an SUV.
So the big gas guzzlers will just. So it's really down to government.
The North Shore station wagon.
Yeah, but this is the frustration, I suppose. So there's just no policy settings to encourage it whatsoever. It's all about burn more oil, just burn more oil. And I'm perplexed by it because I don't know as much as Martijn.
But it's also a transport issue, right? You don't need not everybody needs cars, right? So you buy a car, it sits in your garage most of the week. That's a very expensive capital investment in something you don't use very much. And it just sits there. Whereas if there's a lot of debate around, so there's car sharing, there's basically things about having like, much more autonomous vehicles that drive around and pick people up in some of these. So the new communities that are being designed, a lot of these in the States and elsewhere are being designed car-free, which have a transport system within them. And so the thing is not do I need a car, it's what do I need to get from A to B. So forget about a car, just think, and it's the same with energy. Don't think about do I need coal or gas or renewables. I need energy. What's the most cleanest and cheapest way to get there? So we have to change the mindset thinking. And then incentives is, allow electric vehicles that basically are made of materials that are more environmentally friendly to have no tax on them and heavily tax things that are damaging.
One thing we haven't mentioned is artificial intelligence.
Yep.
And when we talk about getting from A to B and people owning cars, artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, that kind of thing, may revolutionise whether people have a vehicle of their own or there's just these driving cars around the place. You hit your phone, one turns up, picks you up, takes you where you want to go.
Yeah.
No one in it but you.
Yep. It's true.
So artificial intelligence may have a little bit of hope for us, who knows? Who has the microphone next? This lady up here. And how are we going for time?
My question is, we've been talking a lot about getting real estate, and I know that council elections are coming up. And I wonder what the panel think we should be looking for. So council elections are coming up. Can councils do anything about climate change? If they can, what should we be looking for in choosing who to vote for in the council elections?
Do you want me to answer or you want to answer?
Look, I'll just throw in a quick one. There's councils can do a lot. There's a group called City Powers Partnership, Northern Beaches Council, Blue Mountains. Many councils across Australia say they've signed a pact, I suppose you call it, but they all feed off each other, like fleets going green and electric and just so many initiatives. So local government can do a great deal. The other thing I'll mention before I throw over to Martijn, emergency leaders for climate action. So we've put out a climate pledge and it's aimed at federal government. If you go onto our website, emergencyleadersforclimateaction.org.au, I think, and there's a link on the Climate Council site. There's a pledge there for local members of Parliament to sign that they will take 10 actions that will help help deal with the climate emergency. So there's something practical you can do.
Yeah, and I think councils have a very active role to play. I mean, a lot of the councils introduced a motion for a climate emergency. How do you, for example, the council itself, go to full EVs, solar panels, all this sort of stuff? How do you, within the community, provide the facilities that are needed for EVs and for coordinating things, waste collection? There's a whole lot of stuff that can be done. And, I mean, it's interesting, there's people who are in this room who were there. Mosman Council, I never forget, Mosman Council, we were trying to get them to declare a climate emergency. And the night we went in was a bushfire night, and the sky was black with a bit of red. It was like pretty dramatic. And we went in to have this discussion, and it did eventually get up, but it was touch and go. And 3 days before, one of the people who I play sport with, who was a councillor, I had to convince him to change his vote. He was going to vote against it, and I actually, funnily enough, got the former ambassador for the environment to go and brief him on why he should do this. But anyway, he ended up voting, and they did get the climate emergency across the line. But what was interesting, one of the councillors got up and said, "Oh well, I would normally support this, but because of the fact there's no plan and we don't know how we're going to do it, we shouldn't do it." Which basically is just a cop-out, right? So I think pushing people as to what they as council think about the issue and what they were going to do to help facilitate it's important. But there's a huge amount of work which the Climate Council does, and which many of the local councils are doing to work cooperatively on this issue. And I think that's just very important.
Yes, gentleman with the microphone.
Thanks. My name's Chris. There's been a lot of discussion around the fact that the state governments and corporations in Australia are on board for net zero 2050 and take the situation pretty seriously. So my question, I have two questions. One, first of all, why is it important for the federal government to come on board? I mean, what major difference is that going to make? And I know it will, but I'd like to understand, articulate why.
Sure.
And then secondly, when we look at, all this political focus on these marginal coal seats and these places we'll probably never go to or hear from again, what is it really going to take?
Do you mean the Upper Hunter?
Yeah, exactly.
Got a farm there, but anyway.
No, but I mean, it's marginal seats in places that are going to determine the entire outcome of the election. At what point is it going to really matter what kind of we think, and in terms of tipping the balance where urban voters or people that are really quite focused and concerned on this are going to vote independent or go other directions? When does the Liberal Party start worrying about that? And related to that is, well, what is it we can really be doing here, given we're not sitting in marginal coal country seats?
Yeah, so I think there's there's a lot to consider that, but I think the first issue is that it matters because, number one, if the federal government doesn't have a clear and articulate policy, business doesn't know the direction. Secondly, if Australia is an outlier on climate, then we will get trade sanctions against us. And make no mistake that is coming. And so Australian businesses are saying, well, wait a second, why should we suffer from that? Thirdly, it means, why do we go to war in Iraq? I mean, we went to war in Iraq that's another whole issue, but why do we go to world wars, even though we're a tiny country? It's part of a global effort to address an issue that has a global impact, so we should be in there. And finally, because the government, there's a massive opportunity here. There's a huge opportunity to invest in a new global economy that's rapidly decarbonising. Australia's in the best spot to do that. If the government said, let's stop let's think about how can we take advantage of that, then it's a whole different mindset that you're looking at that. And so that's why it's important for the government to set direction, because every single one in business says there's no energy policy. We don't know what to do. It's chaotic. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you should be worried about those seats. So those people who live in those coal seats, they're mums and dads with kids who work hard, they're supporting their families, and if they're in an industry that's going to die, then it's the responsibility of government, as they did in the UK, as they have done in Germany, to say, here is a really good transition plan. This is what we're going to do for your communities to keep them alive and vibrant, and you can do that. Victoria didn't do it very well in the Latrobe, but had the opportunity to do it, but there is that opportunity. And so rather than sort of just ignoring the fact that it's going to happen, because those communities will collapse, what can you do to facilitate the change and make it better for everybody? And what can you do to build the economy? And so that is the responsibility of government, in my view. And they should be doing that. And the irony is we may be in a situation, and I know people in this room are working on it, where you have 4 independent city seats, North Sydney, Warringah, Northern Beaches and Mackellar, and you could find yourself in that really interesting dynamic. And you're right, that will be the balance of power, and it will change. But the fact is, we have a massive opportunity here, and if you had a government that was leading, there is a race on in the moment in the world as to which country is going to be the leader in hydrogen. It could be Australia, right? And it's got to be green hydrogen. But the Japanese have already opened the door and said we want to buy hydrogen in the world at a strike price they've already set. If we can produce that as a massive market, and if we know LNG and other parts of our economy are going to fall, why don't we find the new areas? A lot of people, it's quite interesting. Cannon Brooks has, and those guys have got some powering energy into Singapore, right? People say, oh, that's a crazy idea. Why is it a crazy idea? If we can produce all this renewable energy in Australia, Singapore doesn't want to buy coal and oil and rely on China anymore. We can ship it up there. Norway is shipping electricity to Ireland. So there's no reason we can't ship it up to Singapore. The technology around cabling is rapidly improving. There was a whole plan which fell over because of the civil unrest, but it was originally to put solar panels all over the top of North of Africa and then power it into Europe. So these are not, these things can be done, but if oil is going to disappear, we've got to have an alternative. So to my view, it's a responsibility of government to look after its citizens. It's a responsibility of government to drive the economy forward. And those are two things that this government is not doing, really.
Could I just put in something about the Upper Hunter? Because we do have a place there, and so I did pay particular attention to the results, which were really interesting. The National Party's been losing votes in that electorate for the last 2 decades. They used to get 60% of the vote. They're now down to around 30%. The trouble is, they lost votes this election too, but they didn't go to the Labor Party because the Labor Party picked an ex-coal miner, was a Me Too candidate. So the lost votes from the National Party went to, and the Labor Party lost votes as well. They only lost 3%, but they lost votes as well. So both major parties lost votes in that election by putting forward pro-coal candidates. The majority of those votes that were lost went two ways: to the independents in that seat, who got about 12%, and also, unfortunately, to One Nation. So that's what happened in that seat. What it means is neither major party is offering to the voters of the Upper Hunter an alternative or a way of seeing the future. People in that seat know, we know all our neighbours, a lot of them work in coal, they know coal's dead. They're under no illusions that it's dead. But they've got no one telling them what to do next.
And to prove your point, who was the minister in that region that was also the climate minister? So Greg Conway. So Labor minister in the Hunter, in a coal seat, ex-union and coal miner. Climate minister, huge advocate for climate, voted in. So it was not a coal issue.
No, but we've got two parties that can't find a way to stand up for it. Greg, did you want to say something? Sorry, I just know a bit about that seat, so I thought I'd throw it in.
No, all good. There's more questions. So.
One more? We've got one more? Okay, who's got the microphone? Up the back. The person who has the microphone has the power.
I just want to ask this about the emergency leaders for climate action. I understood that it went through to our local council, but it actually went straight through to Trent Zimmerman.
Sorry, could you
make a protest?
Sorry, what was...
The emergency leaders for climate action, when I pressed on it to send an email, it wasn't to my local council, Gilly Gibson.
No,
it was to Trent
because...
Zimmerman, yeah.
Look, this climate pledge is about the federal government because we believe there'll be a federal election in the next year. Well, there will be. There'll be a federal election coming up, and it is focused on federal candidates to say, are you going to take action to save our planet? But you might want to print it off and take it to your local council as well.
Okay, good, okay.
Thanks.
And I think that means that we've come to the end of our final question, but I have one last one before Trent finishes up for us. I want to ask both Martijn and Greg, so that we don't leave here feeling that, it's all gloom and doom. What can all of us do in our own lives to make a difference to what's happening with our climate directly? What can we do?
Look, I'll be very quick. Vote.
Differently.
Because I think we need massive change in Canberra, and you've got standouts like Matt Keane in New South Wales, Andrew Constance. He and I were a kilometre apart on New Year's Eve. He nearly lost his life trying to get to the beach and then dive in and I was trying to save homes nearby. We worked that out later, but he's a convert. He's electrified. He's getting green energy for the train system, which means there's business opportunities there for people. So, he's doing a lot of great work. So it is conservative. As Matt Keane said, conservative politics is about creating a business environment. How come they don't get it in Canberra? So, if people don't vote Labor or whatever because they're not really offering much more, Zoe Steggall's given the example of somebody who can actually make a difference. So, look, vote and get active. Let people know. I think, there's that saying, quiet Australians. We shouldn't be quiet Australians anymore. We've seen what can happen with climate change. I think we're pretty traumatised by it. 82% of Australians, Australia Institute survey, back with the fires, said 82% of Australians said, yes, this is linked to climate change and we're worried. We need to let people know. And every little bit that you can do in your area of expertise, if you're in business are forging ahead without government, but we need to get the government to catch up and create value in our economy so that we can have first mover advantage, not try and catch up after somebody else just goes ahead with what's so obvious. So,
yeah, I think Greg summed up pretty well. I think regardless of what where a politician stands, whether they're Labor, Liberal, Independent, if they're supporting strong action on this topic, then you back them, because the more backing they get, the stronger they are and the stronger the voice they have. And, you know, it doesn't matter who that is. That's the first thing. And I think secondly, the other thing that's really important is if you ever hear someone saying something that's just not true, or there's misinformation, then make a bit of effort to correct it. Even if it's on, you know, if you see someone on the television saying something, you know, feel free to do that. Or there are organisations like the Climate Council, whose very role is to go and inform things that are wrong, right? So it's about getting accuracy. So I think that's really important. So I think, you know, both of those things, and it's really interesting. I mean, part of the Western Australia tried to introduce this tariff into on solar panels and all this sort of stuff, and there was this massive outcry, and it came from middle income families who had sold and said, don't tell us what to do, it's our roof, it's our solar, you know, get stuff basically. And so people power does work. I mean, a lot of these things, and I think the more that happens, the more the momentum there will be. So I think that's quite important too.
There you go. Change your vote and keep the pressure up. And don't let the bastards get away with lying. You call it misinformation. I'm a lot less polite. Okay, well, thank you so much, Martijn. Thank you so much, Greg. Not just for being here tonight, though that is really important and it's been really valuable, and I, for one, have learned a great deal, but also for all the work and effort that you do every day to fight, to keep our planet in some kind of state to be passed on to the next generation. I feel a terrible failure as a grandparent because I will not be passing on to my grandchildren a planet in as good a state as my grandparents handed on to me, and that I see as a generational failing of us all. So I thank you for doing all you can every day to make a difference. And thank you to Voices of North Sydney for putting on this terrific conversation. Not Voices of North Sydney, what are you?
Hi. We're at North
Sydney Conversations. Oh, well. You can see why I made the mistake.
Thank you, Jane. I would firstly very much like to thank Martijn, Greg and Jane for working with us this evening. It's been such a privilege to have you involved in the second event of North Sydney Conversations. I would certainly like to thank our team as well, Susie, Johnny and Liz, for making this possible, and all of you for coming. We truly appreciate it. We like to leave the audience with some resources and action points at the end of each evening, and the screen's not working tonight, but it is on our website. And it will lead you to links to emergency leaders for climate action, so you can learn more about Greg's incredible organisation and how to take some action through that. Obviously, the Climate Council we've spoken about, I mean, a remarkable organisation that is just growing from strength to strength. They have done an incredible job of bringing in experts across all sorts of professions, including medicine, economics, obviously the science. But if you are in doubt about anything and you need some facts, just go to that resource. It's fantastic. I'd also like to mention, I mean, we are all about conversations, and I do think it's incredibly important for people to talk about climate change. I came from London 2 years ago and was just shocked at how few people were talking about it, hence here I am today. And we work with an organisation out of Melbourne called Climate for Change, who coach people on how to become facilitators in their communities, and they invite people to host a small number of friends, and then they come in and talk. And I know some people in the room here, one is a facilitator, a couple have hosted, and they're just really fabulous ways of sort of just, you know, making people feel comfortable to talk about climate change with their peers and families at Christmas lunch, which we've often laughed about. But I'd also like to mention North Sydney Climate Act Now, that Susie and Mary were very much a part of last year when Zali Steggall launched her climate change bill, and that is still going strong. We're hoping that, you know, the submissions, the record number of submissions, 6,500, that the committee is obviously bearing its way through. But, that's still alive and active. So if you want to sign that petition or even learn more about it, please visit that website. And then on just a simple thing we can all do, I'm sure most of you have done it by now, but if you look up Market Forces, it was mentioned tonight, they're an amazing organisation that have these incredible links on how to divest from fossil fuels. You can put your bank on notice through their website, so just warn them that you're not happy with them investing and you're about to change banks. They lead you through that process. Also with regards to superannuation, insurance companies. So, you can also, which is a very simple one, just change your energy provider with one quick flick of a button so that you're working with Diamond Energy, for example, which is completely fossil fuel free. Tons of different things we can all do tomorrow at home. And also I'd like to mention Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, who are based here in Sydney. And they, if you go tomorrow and buy 10 shares in Santos and hand them over to ACCR, they can actually take those shares with them to an AGM and they accumulate enough of them that they end up having a voice in those meetings. So there are just so many incredible organisations around that are working very, very hard so that we as individuals have a voice, and then it is about power of people. So
it was the CEO of Citibank that wrote that article, wasn't it, Martijn, about there's no such thing as climate change? You might just like to remember that as well.
Yeah. But thank you so much, everybody. And this is a conversation, so please stay and chat to your neighbour, to somebody new tonight. And we're all here for the same reason, so thank you. I appreciate it. We all appreciate it.